check those clocks.
Digital, analog, wall, car,
Grandfather. Grandmother?
Yeah. Coldplay.
Or is it just the grandfather that's ticking there in the background?
You do a cuckoo clock.
Cuckoo clock. Check them. And if you check them, you're going to see that it's a time to think.
Yeah.
It's not a time to blink or a time to stink.
What if there's a cuckoo clock that actually we could program that when it like pops out every hour, it's like, time to think, time to think, time to think.
Or we could just buy a parrot. There's always options.
Yeah, that's true.
It is a time to think, time for careful, thoughtful engagement in issues in the culture and the church. We are in an apologetics series. We have talked about the what and why of apologetics. We've talked about some different methods. On our last episode, we tried to take one method and see how it can be used, even to employ the other ones, but in a subsidiary way. So we took presuppositionalism and tried to use it to say the Christian worldview gives the best explanation of all of the evidences we have, all the while reminding ourselves that even then, there will be many people that reject the evidences, right?
Yep.
That's why we need the no neutrality, no autonomy principle, which I think that I mentioned last time and didn't explain. The no neutrality principle, none of us operate with blank slates. Yep. We all have presuppositions. Maybe we explained that, but we didn't explain no autonomy means none of us have the authority to think on our own. Mm-hmm. You said we think God's thoughts after him. That's the proper response. But the human rebellion is we are a law unto ourselves. Yep. We define for ourselves. We think autonomously. And so really the presuppositional approach wants to call that out and push back at times where someone says, I don't believe because I can't give intellectual justification for it. We want to just say that actually is rebellion against revealed religion, rebellion against divinely given truth. And so we're going to do something similar with the presuppositional worldview approach to the existence of God. And here's actually one where I think it's really, really helpful because I tend to think I'm okay with a book. Some people are okay working on a car. Some people are okay riding a bike. I'm okay with a book, right? I can tend to read one fast and understand it. But even then...
Even your chapter books?
I didn't specify that I meant
okay,
children's board books.
Be clear here, yeah.
I'm okay with a board book,
right,
Chris.
Good.
And I was lost in half of the William Lane Craig chapters about the arguments for the existence of God and the philosophical... No pictures. And I say that because I don't want to get discouraged. I don't want others to get discouraged that in order to defend the existence of God, we have to be able to defend not only every point of Leibniz's argument, but also every point of the Kalam argument and the fine-tuning argument. And really the benefit of the worldview presuppositional approach is it's going to be pretty simple. It's not simplistic in the sense of, we mentioned last time, propaganda just says, just believe what I say.
Right.
It's not simplistic in that way,
check-in.
but it's repeatable.
Right.
So if the repeatability of the Resurrection podcast was, hey, know these three things, you have to be able to explain the empty tomb, the appearances to the disciples, and the sincerity of their faith that led to their martyrdom. Christianity explains those the best. You're like, okay, that's some footholds I can hang on to. It's pretty simple. I can repeat that, and it's persuasive. We want to be able to give some in regards to the existence of God as well. Before we get there, I want to start off again with the idea of absurdity.
Okay.
If you remember, William Lane Craig has that beautiful chapter, I think chapter 2 in his book, Life is Absurd Without God. What he says is, if there's no God and no immortality, our life is ultimately absurd, meaning it's irrational to care about anything. It's irrational to care about legacy. It's irrational to prioritize brotherhood and friendship, but hate racism. I mean, it's just irrational to have moral preference. I mean, it's nothing more than preference at that point. Things I like, things I don't like. Ultimately, there's no meaning. That's his point in that chapter. And he quotes a lot of people. I was trying to find a Bertrand Russell quote that is just... What it shows, what Bertrand Russell helpfully shows, he's an atheist, is he shows the logical conclusions of a belief. Yeah. And he basically says that we have to really come to reckon with the fact that we're just a collocation of atoms There's no, like, all human genius, all ingenuity, all hopes and dreams die in the vast death of the earth. And it's only when we yield
He must
to...
be fun at parties.
He's
huh?
great at parties.
Yeah.
And he says it's only when we yield to unyielding despair that we can enjoy this life. It's like, well, that's irrational, right?
Yeah.
And what Craig is helpfully showing that chapter is that's the end of a world without
Right.
divine, without design, without God. We talked a bit about the immortality piece, where if we have no hope that this world and our bodies get resurrected, then life is ultimately pointless. But the God piece is a little different. Really, it centers around, if we have no God, then morality and rationality are ultimately
Right.
absurd. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that's correct. That's absolutely correct. So, I mean, what aspect are we going to take here? Because there, I mean, this is a...
I honestly asked because I had done all the talking and I thought it would be your turn to talk. So but maybe I'll set up one more thing and then let you run with it. Craig walks through meaning, value, and purpose.
Okay.
Meaning, all of those kind of combining with the ideas of why you're living and for what you're living, being purposeless if ultimately you were not created for anything.
Yeah.
And you're not held accountable to anyone.
Yep.
Right? And that's going to be the beginning of the presuppositional approach, is to say that two areas we can prove the existence of God are the areas of morality and rationality.
Yep.
And the approach is, someone says they don't believe in God, and then you do see they have some sort of moral framework they work off of.
Yep.
And there's almost always a really extreme example. You can present Rwandan genocide.
Right.
Obviously, you're not trying to be a jerk here. These are serious things, but you can present Rwandan genocide. You can present the Holocaust. You can present egregious examples of child abuse. You can present something that eventually gets someone to say that's immoral and that's wrong. And the presuppositional approach is to say that can't be objectively wrong unless there is a moral lawgiver, right?
Right.
So let's deal first with that the statement would be morality presupposes God.
Yeah. So, I mean, these are all examples, of I guess what you call transcendent existentialism. Okay. So,
you would call it that. Would I call it that? What does that mean?
Call it that if you want. So existentialism, it's the idea of like, there's something just like inherent to being, right? It's existence, existentialism. And what these are appeals to when we think about the existence of God, these are appeals to the idea of something transcendent that goes beyond personal experience. And so personal experience matters if it's couched within the context of something that is significant apart from it, but related to it. So evidence, facts, are not existential, right? So somebody alive today did not witness the resurrection of Jesus Christ, right? They didn't witness the resurrected Jesus. But there is something to be said as far as like, are you going to convince somebody? What's the significance of these things, right? So we're going to think, what's the significance of the existence of God for somebody today? Is it enough to say that there are reasons to believe? Sure, there are reasons to believe, but there is something more fundamental to that, and that is your personal experience hangs on the existence of God. And furthermore, it hangs on the existence of God apart from your existence. So if you...
It hangs on the existence of God apart from your existence.
Apart from existence, yeah.
I've understood the sentence structure.
So for there to be meaning in your life, there has to be meaning if your life doesn't exist. So if you are simply the center of the universe, right? And this is one of the philosophical problems people have, like the problem of other minds, right? The idea that perhaps you are the only one that actually exists and you are simply the dreamer who is unawake. You
in our last podcast, I was the only one that existed because you left me and I'm still bitter about it. You just walked out. I must have been so dumb.
Oh, no, not at all.
Okay. So for your life to have meaning,
it has to mean something apart from the fact that you exist.
Yeah.
And why this is significant to us is because if you're the center, right? Like if you're the center of everything, first of all, it doesn't make sense, right? You can't actually locate reality around a particular individual who at one time was not. You can't do that. The world existed prior to you coming into being. So you came into being at some point, but you do know that your life as a matter of being does matter now. And so for you to make sense of the fact that your life does matter now, you have to begin with the fact that it didn't exist at some point. And so this is kind of the reverse argument of immortality. This is a backwards argument. It's saying, okay, what accounts for the fact that this world existed before me? And what accounts for the fact that things happen in this world that mattered apart from my experience of that mattering. Because all of us do want to feel on a regular basis that what we do matters and what we feel matters and what happens to us matters. And so with the issue of morality, we start from that place of recognizing, okay, significance is only real if I'm not the only one determining that. If I'm the one determining significance, then there cannot be anything truly significant because I did not exist when other things happened. All right. So this is just kind of a philosophical, thinking through this stuff. Like, okay, does this really matter? Were moral, actions performed prior to my coming to being? Now, the classic example of this that everybody wants to use is Hitler, right? Everybody wants to think about the Holocaust. Like, was that an evil thing? Well, if evil and good is dependent on your definition of evil and good, well, then it wasn't an evil thing because you didn't exist at that point.
Sure.
However, if something apart from you determines whether or not an action is good or evil, you can either acquiesce to that and say, yes, that was evil, that was good, or you can basically deny the fact that good and evil exist. But at that point, you have to give up the idea that there is any significance of any action morally.
Yeah.
So as far as this idea of transcendent existentialism, what we're doing is recognizing with somebody that you do experience moral decision making, and yet your moral decision making only has significance if it is in relationship to something that is apart from you. And so why is the Holocaust bad? Was it simply bad because it was a bad experience for certain people 80 years ago? Well, of course, it was a bad experience for people 80 years ago. But could somebody say at that point, well, I'm making meaning for myself right now, which is what we do today. We just don't do it on a large scale, right? We don't commit these genocidal acts today. So we have to start locating, apart from us, our experience of something that we encounter every day that we're always making decisions regarding.
Yeah. So to kind of see the threading through up to this point, the reason to potentially use the absurdity of life without God as a starting point apologetically is to help the unbeliever realize that that's the logical conclusion,
right?
But also to give them a little bit of, I don't believe that, right?
Exactly.
I don't believe nothing matters. I do believe things matter. Right. And so then the turn is things only matter if, right? And so now you're using their own existential conclusion, right? Because I do think, as you said, all of us have to have some sort of this matters or else we don't get out of bed.
Yep.
Part of depressiveness is like nothing matters.
Exactly.
To get up and do anything, to go to work, it's got to be to provide for my family or to provide a name for myself or to it's got to matter at some level. And so when it comes to morality, you're appealing to that. It's not neutral ground, it's common ground, it's Christian ground, that all of us live lives that do ultimately matter because God has made us. And so even if someone doesn't believe God has made us, God has made them. And so their life does ultimately matter. And you're trying to prove that it only matters if God has made
right, exactly.
Right. Can you tell me, Chris, if we need something that transcends Chris to have morality that matters, why can we not just have a culture? Yep. Culture transcends Chris, right? Modern America transcends Chris. It's more than you. It's outside of you. It includes you, but it's not secluded to you. Why can it not just be a culture that creates the morality?
Yeah, I mean, there are multiple problems attached to that. First of all is what determines culture, right? So at what point have you reached critical mass going from an individual to perhaps a family, to a clan, to a community, to a culture, right? Where along this process has somebody actually come to that conclusion and said, now this matters because the collective has agreed to it. So right there is just, a problem of numbers. Where do people actually pass into that? Now this is a binding moral statement as opposed to this was a suggested moral statement or personal desire moral statement before. We run into the fact that there are cultures that have expressed particular things that have been morally reprehensible to the vast majority of humanity. So going back to the Hitler example, Nazi Germany, there were hundreds of thousands of people who more or less went along with the idea that it was right to commit murder in the nth degree, right? That's just that was a culture. And
so a culture transcends Chris, but doesn't transcend all other cultures.
Exactly. So if we, compare cultures, cannibalistic culture and go to Papua New Guinea, you find people who are eating people to this day. That is a culture, right? So do we just respect sociologically these things? And what we then come to the conclusion of is that simply by removing the epicenter of that decision making from the individual, moving it to a collection of individuals, we're still coming to a place where we're having to assess the value and the validity of these types of moral claims on the basis of, are they actually right or wrong?
Right.
Regardless of whether or not a number of individuals have believed them to be true. And we see throughout history that, yes, indeed, people have disagreed about what is right and wrong.
So to have something that's right or wrong, you have to have someone telling you it's right or wrong. That could be Chris. Chris could be telling you this is right, this is wrong.
Mhm.
I mean, if you're Chris's kids, maybe you
Right.
got to believe him. If you're Chris's friend, maybe not. If you're someone across the globe, you have no
Who
relation.
cares?
Right. But you could have a culture telling you what's right or wrong. And
Yeah.
the question then becomes, what makes that not just preference?
Right.
What makes that not ignorant?
Mm-hmm.
At what level is it simple majority decides? Right. That's
Yep.
in a strict democracy, simple majority.
Yep.
So is morality changing based on popular vote?
Right.
These are the types of questions. If you don't have a transcending norm,
Mm-hmm.
if you don't have something that's someone outside of culture, outside of Chris, even outside of time, as we'll argue,
Yep.
then you don't have anything to bear on why this standard is right or wrong
Mm-hmm.
objectively at all times for
Right.
all people. It boils down to preference and numbers.
Yep.
And I don't think any of us want to argue that things are right or wrong based on numbers.
On 50% plus one. Yeah.
Right. This is where John Frame is helpful in presenting the idea. I think it seems unique to him. I don't know that Van Til did it as clearly as him. If he did, is the idea of a personal absolute. And so
yes. Yep.
did Van Til bring up the personal absolute?
I'm sure he did. I'm
Okay.
sure he did, because most of Frame is Van Til. But
Yeah. The frame is Van Til with sanded edges. Took off the rough
And
edges.
piano playing skills.
He can play piano.
Oh, yeah, he can
We
play
should
piano
bring
very
him
well.
on. He could do our intro music. So he presents, a common objection he says that he gets is people will say, well, if I have to investigate Christianity, I have to investigate every other religion. I just don't have time for that. And he says, well, let me prove to you why Christianity is unique among all
Yes.
religions. He has a couple different ways to do that. And
Mhm.
one of them is by talking about a personal absolute.
Mhm.
He simplifies all religious positions down to either impersonal or personal.
Mhm.
So pantheism is impersonal.
Yep.
The world is God.
Mhm.
The world is divine. Chris and I are part of the divine. So we're personal as part of the impersonal.
Mhm.
You have like some of the Greek religions where they had personal gods,
Mhm.
but outside of the personal gods was fate.
Yeah.
So really the absolute in
Was
that religion
governing
was
the
not
personal gods.
Yeah, and you see that come out in Shakespeare sometimes where
Sure.
fate is the driver of the story. And so in that religious scheme, sure, there are persons, but outside of the persons, there's an impersonal absolute.
Mhm.
And so Frame basically asks the question, can we boil down all the personality of our universe to an impersonal force? Okay, evolution would be an impersonal absolute, this kind of unguided, undirected, that's the same thing, process.
Yeah.
Impersonal.
That always works.
The question we want is, does the personality we experience in this world, the love, the relationship,
Mhm.
the intellect, the rationality, all these things, can that be boiled down to the impersonal? And so he basically says, no, it's irrational to say the impersonal created the personal.
Right.
Well, then he looks at other personal religions. So you've got Hinduism. There's a lot of persons, a lot of
Yep.
personal gods, right? You've got Islam. There is a person that's
Mhm.
God. He says neither of these can be personal absolutes, though, because in polytheism, no one's absolute. They're all
Mhm.
fighting. Some of them have the gods of the
Right.
sun. Some of them got the earth, but they're all fighting. That's really, we'll probably talk about this in the Genesis series, the Enuma Elish,
Sure.
kind of this old Babylonian creation myth. You just see these gods
Some
fighting
weird
and
stuff
warring,
happening. Yep.
and it's chaotic. So they're personal,
Yep.
but they're vengeful, and they're not absolute. They're
Right.
killing each
And
other.
we're more moral than they are.
Yes. And so Frame says even Allah is not absolute, because for this singular God to love, as he claims to do, he needs something to love. So he actually needs the creation in a way that
Right.
the God of the Bible does not. So even the closest thing we see to the God of the Bible purported is the God of Islam, but in being singular, he cannot be what he says to be
Right.
without the creation. Therefore, he's not absolute. He's needful of the creation.
Yep.
And so Frame's able to boil down the Christian God to a personal absolute. God is not in need of the creation. He is within himself, Father, Son, and
Mhm.
Spirit, self-sufficient.
Yep.
Creation is not out of a need, but out of an overflow. And he's personal. Like we can explain all of the personality of our universe through the design and the personality and communion of God.
Yep.
Now, if that sounds really meta, where it boils down to morality is presuppositionalists want to say that a personal absolute is the only one that we can use as a defense for objective morality.
It's the only ought giver.
Right. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So a personal absolute is the only thing that account for you ought to do something.
Yeah.
Right. And so, what Frame talks about is the idea of gravity. Okay. Gravity is it's a force, but it's an impersonal force. There's nothing binding on a human being about obeying gravity, except the fact that, you have to actively seek to disobey it. But there's nobody offended by the fact you're disobeying gravity.
If you theoretically were to just try to jump all day and say, I'm going to defy gravity, I would think you're dumb, but not immoral.
But it's not immoral, right? Exactly.
You're a fool, but not a wicked one.
Yeah, to fly an airplane, are you defying gravity? No, you're not. You're just working with gravity as an assumption, and your physical
What if you're
principles.
Idina Menzel and you're defying gravity?
Oh, you mean Adele Dazeem?
No.
You remember that?
Nope.
John Travolta?
Nope.
Academy Awards?
Come on, I make a movie, a pop culture reference, and you don't even give me credit for it.
So what was the Idina Menzel reference? Was it Let It Go?
Do you want me to sing it?
Sure.
It's Wicked. Defying Gravity. That's like the
I've
pinnacle
never seen
song.
It, and I never want to see it.
Okay. So Defying Gravity, if you do an airplane.
Yeah. So, I mean, you do that. Nobody is losing their minds because, oh, look at that airplane. It's flying through the sky, seeming to defy gravity. That's capital case, over this issue. But a personal law is much different. So if as a parent, you go to your child and you say, hey, I don't want you jumping up and down right now. That's different, right? You're not asking them to obey gravity. You're asking them to obey you. Yeah, jumping on the bed. And so the idea of a personal absolute is very important. It's very important.
Because, and so that's where Frame and his followers will talk about obligations. That when we're using our common sense realism in this world and we say, who do we have obligations to?
Yep.
We don't ever say necessarily, what do we have obligations to in the sense of I've got obligations to the tree.
Yep.
I've got obligations to the law of gravity. No, I have obligations to Chris. I have obligations to my wife. I have obligations to my kids. When we are obliged to do something, when we ought to do something, it's to a person.
And the consequence is personal, right? So there's a consequence to defying gravity, and so you fall down. But again, gravity is not going to shame you for it. It's just you're going to experience it. But for a person, this is where guilt comes in to the existential component here. So there is guilt when personality is involved. There's not guilt when impersonality is involved. Nobody feels guilty over defying natural laws. That just doesn't happen. You feel guilty, however, if you defy personal. I mean, just think about the most basic of things, right? So think about the movie theater experience. All right, maybe you've felt this way, Josh.
I saw Wicked in theaters.
Oh boy,
it's a movie play.
Okay, well, anyways. When you go to the theater, there's a sign that says, no what?
Smoking? I've really only been to theater like once in the last 7 years, so I'm not playing dumb.
No carry-ins.
Oh, okay.
Right? Now, is there a law in the books that says you can't bring junior mints into this movie?
I don't think so.
No, nowhere. There's nowhere. But you see the sign that says no carry-ins, and you're thinking, oh, I'm going to get in trouble, right? Now, is that sign on the wall because there's a natural law that says carry-ins cannot happen here? This is a physical space in which carry-ins cannot exist. No, it's because the owners of the establishment are requesting personally that you not bring carry-ins into this movie theater. And so you have this just inner sense of guilt thinking, oh, what if I get caught bringing junior mints in?
Yeah.
Now, the 16-year-old kid working at the register is not going to come after you with a nightstick and just bust your knees because you brought junior mints in. But there is that sense of, I have a personal obligation at this point. Somebody could find me out. And so when we think about guilt and moral guilt, we have to involve a personal standard, which is not just a corporate standard, right? So go back to the idea of collective cultural morality. We are not concerned. I mean, if you think about something that is culturally reprehensible, you obviously don't want to be broadcast to everybody. But if something might be, culturally, whatever. Think about having an affair, right? Now, having an affair is something that somebody could say, well, if you get found out, that's not good, right? You don't be on Cheaters, right? The TV show or something. But at the end of the day,
it's pretty justifiable in our current
Right.
culture. Were you not happy? Was
Right.
was your spouse not
or
giving
just
you
even
what
divorce.
you needed?
Divorce is probably easier to justify in terms of culture, because divorce is something that, more than half of people do at this point. And so, you get a divorce, you're in the majority. Now, do you have an obligation to this person? Well, is there guilt involved with the divorce? The divorce is a guilt-inducing experience, not necessarily because the culture is saying it's wrong, because the culture is saying do whatever you feel like doing, but because you realize there is something personal being broken at this point. And now I feel guilt because there is something that has gone, even if it's somebody who's breaking trust with us, we know that the trust that's been violated is a personal trust.
Yeah.
They're not breaking a natural law, they're breaking personal law. And so when we think about morality, it has to have the ought component attached to it. It just absolutely has to, which, to be perfectly honest, is, I think, sufficient grounds for anybody who believes in morality. And this is where we go to presuppositions. You have to believe something to be true. Ultimately, if you're going to base anything on it, you have to believe that science is true, right? If you want to build your life on science. Well, if you have any scruples and you believe that morality is in any way or shape or form an objective thing, you must believe that God exists, because a personal absolute is the only thing that can demand that.
Yeah, so we're arguing here that morality presupposes God for the reason that Chris just stated. A personal absolute, we've talked about obligations. The personal absolute that transcends not only Chris and Josh and American culture and the 21st century, but transcends space and time,
Yep.
is the only one that
Interstellar.
can give us a this is wrong without qualification.
Correct.
So we need an obligation to someone. We experience that we do not have obligations to some things, not to this chair or this book.
Mhm.
I can pick up a book and not read it.
Right.
But if I don't read the book that's been assigned to me by a person,
Correct.
I
Yeah.
have an
That's
obligation
exactly right.
and a consequence. Now,
Yeah.
this is the other piece of it is for morality to be binding, there has to be an authority that can do something about
Yes.
it, right? This is where the idea of the end of all things matters.
Mhm.
If there is not some sort of judgment of actions, then actions are ultimately absurd.
Correct.
That's the logic. And I say ultimately, right? You can tell me, no, I see the consequences of my actions in this life. They hurt other people or they hurt myself. But we're talking ultimates here.
Yeah.
If there is no end of days, that was good and that was bad, that was right and that was wrong, this is reward, this is punishment,
Mhm.
then everything is ultimately meaningless morality-wise,
Right.
because the earth burns, everyone dies,
Mhm.
and no one has record of your rightness or wrongness. Who cares who you hurt?
So the only thing that matters is power.
Yeah.
It's Nietzsche.
And so, and that was exactly Nietzsche's argument was, ironically, let's get rid of this religious coercion and power
So I can coerce people.
so we can be left with coercion and power. And so let's reflect on that, Chris. If there is no judgment day,
Yeah.
Modern evangelicalism, we love to talk about grace and atonement, Jesus' forgiveness. Those are all wonderful parts of the good news. One professor brought up recently, though, that I think in Acts chapter 17, the resurrection is used as confirmation of final judgment.
Yes.
So one of the things we're supposed to see as Jesus rises from the dead is that he's
God has
coming
fixed
back
a day
to
in
judge.
which judgment. Yeah, absolutely.
And so why do we need final judgment for morality to be real and meaningful?
Yeah, because consequence is so, there's consequence to impersonal law, right? So you fall down, hit your head if you jump off a roof. Okay, so it's just going to happen. There's natural consequence to something that is absolute in nature. Gravity is absolute, regardless of the relativity of the object that is gravitational toward. It's just that there is an absolute reality about gravity. You can't defy it unless you're actually working against it.
Right.
But when it comes to the idea of consequence, of personal consequence, there is always consequence. There always is, because relationship is violated. Okay, and this is very important when it comes to the idea of personal, like the personal, and where like Christianity can differ from Islam significantly, and how people conceive of judgment, because people think, okay, well, there's an absolute, okay, yes, and the contingency argument when it comes to Allah and the creation is, we can have that discussion, but I guess the issue here when it comes to like how is personal offense involved? People ask the question commonly. If I'll talk with somebody and they'll say, well, but what I'm doing isn't hurting anybody. Like if I agree to do it and this other person agrees to do it, tends to come in terms of, human sexuality, then what does it matter? Does this God really care? Well, if the God we're talking about is the God of deism, the God we're talking about is even the God of Islam, then he's removed from his creation.
Yeah.
Right. And so this God is basically hanging somewhere above the heavens, and he may swoop in one day to bring judgment because he's kept a record like Santa Claus. Okay. That's not the God of Christianity. The God of Christianity, in Acts 17, when Paul says, in him we live and move and have our being and everything, like he's saying, like, he is very present.
Yeah.
And he is not everything, but he is present at all places, right? So this is not the God of pantheism, or the gods of pantheism, whatever you want to call it, where everything is part of divinity. But God permeates this universe. Furthermore, he has authority over this universe. So I think it was Kuyper who said that, like, there's not one square inch of this universe of which God doesn't claim this is mine. And so when we think about consequence, what we're recognizing here is that because God is personal and absolute in nature, that any violation of this personal absolute is a personal violation.
Yeah.
And so for this God, and this is where we kind of, climb the little tree up to see, what are the implications of this for theology generally. For this God to be good means that the ultimate standard of right and wrong, which we recognize to be God himself, a violation of the person of God, must result in consequence. It has resulted in consequence because a person has been violated. We don't ever, in our corresponding interactions as human beings interpersonally, we don't ever recognize violations as being inconsequential.
So if I was doing a logical syllogism of your argument, when persons are violated, there are consequences.
Yes.
God is a person. When God is violated, there are consequences. That would be a simple way to say this is why there have to be ultimate consequences for our sin, or else it doesn't matter.
Correct. And so, now, where does grace fit into this? That's a different conversation, because what we see in the cross of Christ is that God has dealt with consequences, right?
Amen.
That's why the cross matters, is because the God who's been personally violated has personally taken punishment for those that he would redeem. However, that being said, apart from that intervention on God's part for those who would trust in a righteousness that's not their own, external in nature, what we're seeing is that these violations, it's not in James. James says that whoever keeps the whole law but violates it at one point, he's being accountable to the whole thing. And that might seem like, well, that seems unfair. That seems harsh. Don't you see all the good work I've done? This is a common argument that people who are not Christian people will say. Have I not done enough good to outweigh the bad? Well, if God is an impersonal force, if God is simply going to weigh the scales and say, oh, yes, I see that you have kept this standard of good apart from me, well, then, you can maybe make an argument for that, but that's not what's happening. What we're seeing here is that the standard of good is defined by God himself. So a violation of God and his person is a violation of what is good, of what is inherently good. And so what we're dealing with in the breaking of the law of God is not a breaking of some external standard apart from God. What we're doing is violating God's own person. And so we are sinning against him. And so the consequence of sin is found in the fact you've sinned against God. You've sinned against a person. And then the gravity of that comes into the who is the one you've sinned against. And then you think, oh, this is the one who made me. This is the one who sustains me. This is the one who is inherently good and I am not. I violated his person. And so there's a consequence attached to that.
Yeah. So you can read a lot on this. You can know a lot on this. What we're trying to help you see is there is a really simple reproduction of this argument that it's not overly simplistic, but it is repeatable. And it's that if morality exists, it presupposes God.
Yeah.
The person that you're talking to believes morality exists, unless they're really philosophically committed to their position, at which case they're either too far gone personally, or you can, in front of others, show that that's not what many people believe.
Right.
I mean, that goes back to the absurdity piece.
Yep.
If you really bring up really heinous moral actions like the Holocaust and someone says, yeah, really, that's just cultural preference, then you kind of go, you guys see this? Because none of y'all believe that. Like there is an irrationality that some people will hold to, but you just got to be able to say, if you're there, then I can't do anything here other than pray. Or if other people are watching, like in a debate setting, you say,
do you not see?
I don't think anyone else believes that in here. And so there's that. So if morality presupposes God, people existentially, their morality, that matters. We need someone transcendent, and this transcendent, in order for there to be obligations and authority, this transcendent needs to be a person, right? And not just far away in the clouds, but a God who matches the transcendence and immanence of the God of the Bible. So that's one argument for God using something that people already believe in, morality. Another quick one, we won't go super in depth on this one, is the argument of rationality. This is the standard Van Til transcendental argument. It's basically, if I'm talking to you, God exists.
Right.
Because if you and I have cognitive abilities to have a discourse, if we can understand speech and language, if we can rationally communicate, then that presupposes something has to be behind that. And the thing that has to be behind that is a God who has wired us to do those things. If you wanted to weigh that against another worldview, what of natural evolution makes us think that we would end up with brains that communicate?
Right.
If you just think about that, like, we're not going to go into depth on that. Maybe when we get to like God and science in a couple episodes, but there's nothing inherent in unguided naturalistic evolution that leads me to think that we would get to a place where Chris and I can talk,
or that necessitates it, right?
Or it is the same kind of argument is there for truth, where it's evolution doesn't necessitate truth. Why do we care about something that's true? Why do we dislike things that are false? Because evolution leads to survival, not truth. Now, if truth helps you survive, great, but the ultimate there is survival.
Yeah.
So who cares about truth? There's no guarantee, there's no necessity that you end up with a brain that prioritizes true thinking.
Sure.
But indeed, we do have brains that care about true thinking. We do have brains that care about rationality. Another way to get at this, I think Alvin Plantinga has talked about the fact that if we think our brains work, he'll call them cognitive faculties, I'll call them brains. If we think our brains work, then they have to work given certain surroundings for certain purposes by a certain design. And when you start to think those questions, you think, well, that had to be designed. So there's kind of a logical backtracking. If my brain works, and I believe it does, it must have been designed by someone to work in specific ways in specific environments that lead to rational communication. So that's another quick argument. You can say even just thinking rationally presupposes a God who has ordered the universe. Same thing with science. Science presupposes God. If we think that actually the world is predictable enough and ordered enough that we could run experiments where we change one variable and see what happens, we do it today and tomorrow and the next day. We know that the world is so ordered. What makes most sense of that ordering? Divine design or naturalistic evolution? So those are some quick arguments for the existence of God. I do want to ask though, Chris, what do you find to be the place of some of the more technical arguments, like a cosmological argument that's based on the universe had to be caused, or a teleological argument that's based on, hey, we scientifically see that it is probably going towards some sort of ultimate end, or the fine-tuning argument that it seems that if there was a hair's difference in some of the guaranteed laws of gravity type things in our universe, I forget what the category is called, but if there was a hair's difference, then life would be inhabitable. So it seems, what is the place for the Christian in knowing one or many of those arguments?
I grew up watching MacGyver.
Okay.
I love MacGyver. And I just watched the other day, in fact, my birthday. I was like, I feel nostalgic today. I want to think about my youth. And MacGyver always had with him one particular item. What was that, Josh?
I don't know. I've only watched MacGruber, which was the SNL spoof of MacGyver. So I really don't actually know anything about MacGyver.
He always had a Swiss Army knife.
Okay.
Right. And so he always had a Swiss Army knife on him. And that Swiss Army knife bailed him out of so many different situations because it had the essentials, right? It had the essential tools for him to get out of a lot of spots. Now, a couple of years ago, my parents asked me for, ideas for a Christmas gift or something. And as I'm getting older and my parents are getting older, I want memorable Christmas gifts from them, memorable birthday gifts, things that are not going to be like, hey, can I have a new toy? So I asked for a nice Swiss Army knife. Because it's something you keep around. And as you're looking through this list of Swiss Army knives, you think like, oh man, I can go with like the basic one, like I had when I was in Cub Scouts.
The red one.
Yeah. Well, and so you think through like what's basic here, and then what's like the deluxe. And there are some that Victorinox makes that are like, they've got magnifying glasses and all kinds of weird things like tied into it, but it's this really thick, probably like 2-3 inch wide knife. I'm like, well, I'm not going to keep that with me. That's ridiculous. I might need something like that at some point, but it's not going to be in my arsenal. Like it's not going to stay with me all the time. I would see these types of arguments as being probably similar to that, because they might be useful. And, in a certain situation, yeah, you might need a magnifying glass or something. Okay. So know that it's there. But it's kind of the difference between what's the Swiss Army knife you keep with you all the time? What's the Swiss Army knife you put in your camping bag?
Sure.
And so if you know you're going to be in a situation where you're talking to somebody who might be well-versed in philosophy, who might have a lot of questions that they ask about high-level meta issues, hey, by all means, bone up on these things. Familiarize yourself with these types of arguments because they are useful. And they are, I think, compelling if somebody is going to actually have a back and forth over this that isn't just spitting in somebody's face. But by and large, I don't think most people are necessarily concerned with irreducible complexity. I don't think most people are there. I think most people are asking the questions of like, hey, I wake up in the morning, go to bed at night. And in a world in which that is, is so infected with postmodern thought, why do I even do these things? Why is it that self-harm exists? Why is it that people take their own lives? Why do people leave their families? Why do people, mutilate their bodies? Why are these things happening? It's because people are walking around unmoored from the significance of human existence. And they're trying to find meaning. They're trying to find purpose. And that's one of the reasons why I find like the transcendental argument for the existence of God, presuppositional apologetics so compelling in our particular culture, is because we are around people, right? And the point of apologetics is not to win arguments. The point of apologetics is to point people to Christ and to win people to Christ. And so if we're dealing with people who are fundamentally asking questions about their own experience each day, day in, day out, asking that, why does Jesus matter for me? It's like understanding that Jesus is who he says he is has every bearing on what you do, on who you are as a human being. So let's work with that. And, is the teleological argument for the existence of God, is that something? Yeah, it could be something if somebody is really struggling with that thought about what's the point of everything? What's the end? What's the goal of everything that I do here? But really at the end of the day, I think you need to familiarize yourself with the idea that helping people see that the way they live right now is actually not consistent with what they think or say they believe about the world, and then helping them understand the Bible makes sense of life. I think that's the most helpful thing for any Christian to have ready when it comes to making defense of their faith.
Yeah. So the pressure is not have a comprehensive grasp of all arguments so you can be prepared for all circumstances.
Right.
It's not be unprepared, right? We talked about it in the first podcast. But we don't need a Lone Ranger view of apologetics where even just Josh has all the arguments.
Right.
So one of the benefits of the community of the church is if someone presented to me an apologetic argument that I'd never heard before, I might call Chris, and vice versa. Or if you have, maybe you've got down 3 or 4 basic arguments you feel really comfortable with. So if things come up about morality or about design, and then something else comes up, you call your pastor, or you invite this non-believer into a group so that they can answer questions together, and you rely on more than just yourself. Yep. There is a danger in thinking that I have to personally master all of the arguments before I can engage. And like you said, if you engage with someone who says, yeah, but what about this? And you don't know, say, hey, can I have some time to think about it? And you can ask.
You take a time to think.
Yeah, you could come back to one of these episodes. You could ask us for resources. You could take some time to think, and then you could show this non-believer, hey, I took a lot of time to think about your objection, and I would like to answer it now. Yeah. There's a humility and a care there that's not just about you getting in and out of one argument while winning. One more thing as far as the existence of God goes that I'll highlight because it'll lead us into our next series of episodes is there can be an objection to God that goes something like this. The God of the Bible is a moral monster. And oftentimes that's used as an objection to the existence of God, but it's not an objection to the existence of God. It's an objection to the God of the Bible. Right. And so just to have that in our purview, that if you're talking about whether or not God exists and someone says, well, the God you worship is a moral monster, you say, so are we asking about God's existence, or are we asking about the God of the Bible? Right. Because that's really an objection of, I don't like this God who exists, not an objection to the existence of God proper. And that's where we'll get into on one of our next episodes about morality and evil and how those things actually vindicate God. We've talked about there needing to be a God for there to be morality. We'll talk more specifically about the problem of evil, and maybe we could talk about the character of God in that. And what does that tell us when someone has that objection? Any final thoughts on arguments for the existence of God?
No.
I'm always instructed when I ask Chris for final thoughts and he says no. And I'm like, I don't know if anyone has ever asked me for final thoughts and I've said no. Even now, I'm still talking. Whatever. Thanks for joining us on A Time to Think.